Yo, what is up guys? Delboy here, aka Blue Collar Sports TV. Hopefully you guys are doing well. If you're new here, hit subscribe, smash the like, all of that good stuff. So Tszyu defeats Tony Harrison by a 9th round stoppage to win the WBO interim super welterweight title of the world. I have to say, I was pretty impressed with Tszyu's performance against Tony Harrison. Tony Harrison, of course, being a former world champion and a guy who's been in and around the top 10 of the division for many years now. You know, Tony Harrison's got a lot of experience. He's a tricky boxer with a lovely jab, good movement, underrated power when he sits down on shots. He's a good boxer, Tony Harrison, and he's one of those guys to where if you're not at a certain level, I think he's the sort of guy who can expose you. But Tszyu in this fight, he proved he was at this level. At this point in time, I know there's been skepticism surrounding Tszyu on the come up, but there's no denial now. Tszyu is a legitimate contender at 154 pounds. In fact, I would say he is the number one contender at 154 pounds. If any of you have been following this channel for a long period of time, you would know I've covered Tszyu from basically the start of his career, well before he was fighting 10-rounders, 12-rounders. You know, we really started covering him in the infancy of his career. And initially, I saw a guy in Tszyu who had promise, he had potential, but at the same time, you know, he wasn't exactly a guy who I was pinning any great expectations on. He was a solid prospect, decent enough, some good attributes here and there. But as the years have passed, and as I followed his career, the more and more I started to believe in him. Number one, I have to say, Tszyu has been matched incredibly well throughout his career. And I don't mean that in regards to soft matchmaking. I mean that as in, he's had solid slight step-ups in his last few fights. Basically ever since he's been at sort of 10-12 round level. I mean, if you look at his career, he's cleaned out domestically in Australia. You know, he's beaten tough guys like Jack Brubaker, for example. Joel Calamari, I seem to recall him fighting. You know, these guys aren't great, but they are sort of tough guys. And yeah, I liked how Tszyu went through the Australian circuit. He then stepped up to fight Jeff Horn, who at the time was arguably Australia's most notable fighter, or most well-known fighter. He beat Jeff Horn in a big fight environment. That was a big pay-per-view in Australia, and since then I think he's really been moved well. Fought Dennis Hogan, who of course has been in and around fringe world level for a long time. He dealt with Dennis Hogan. He beat Steve Spark. Takashi Inoue, who's been a former world title challenger. You know, he fought a few sort of fringe level guys. Terrell Gausha, another one. That was his first fight in America. Had a couple of problems in that fight, but I felt he won that fight clearly. The scorecards were way too close in that fight. And of course, most recently, on Saturday, he beat Tony Harrison, a former world champion at 154 pounds. And I have to say, I personally felt that was Tszyu's best performance of his career. One thing I really like about Tszyu is that he's got certain similarities and he has certain traits that his father had. No shit, Delboy, right? But what I mean by that is his in-ring temperament is strikingly similar to his father's. Tszyu was a guy who was extremely calm, extremely composed, liked to get behind that jab, see what he was doing. He wouldn't waste anything. He wouldn't go gung-ho. Tszyu was a really textbook fighter. He was a very deliberate fighter, and his approach was very systematic. And I see that in his son. Technically, there are differences between Tszyu and Tim. Like Tszyu, for example, relied much more heavily on his jab, and I think his straight punches in general were a lot better, and I think pound for pound, Costa was a bigger puncher. But Tszyu shares that innate in-ring calmness that his father had. I like the fact that when I see Tszyu fight, even when he's taking step-ups, things of that nature, he never looks flustered. He never looks concerned. He's got a really good poker face, and he never really gets overzealous. And I like the fact that he is very systematic in his approach. And I think we saw that against Tony Harrison. Tony Harrison being a mover who's got a really nice quick jab, and he can hold his feet and fire straight down the middle with hard right hands. We saw Tszyu, I nearly called him Costa. We saw Tszyu in this fight with Tony Harrison slowly but surely chip away at Tony Harrison. I liked what he was doing, setting traps on the front foot, countering sometimes on the front foot. You know, he was applying pressure and letting Tony Harrison take the lead in a lot of occasions. It was rare in this fight where you saw Tszyu really overextend to try to catch the moving guy in Tony Harrison. That was very rare. He was very methodical in his approach in regards to applying pressure. And when he got Tony Harrison in trouble, really, really good finish. Really good punch picking with his right hand. I think he hurt Tony Harrison with a right hand around the side, like a chopping overhand right. And, you know, he hurt Tony Harrison. And after that, Tszyu did a great job of not smothering his work. He was a little he was a little too one-handed for my liking, but it got the job done. But regardless, he never smothered his work. He maintained his range and the correct distance when Tony was hurt. And he unloaded a series of right hands on Tony, both looping right hands around the side and also a series of right uppercuts. I would have liked to have seen, it's kind of harsh, but because he got the stoppage. But I would have liked to have seen Tim try to be a bit more two-handed in that final attack. But I'm splitting hairs here. Another thing that I was impressed with Tszyu in this fight, and Fight Film, big up to Fight Film, made this point in his post-fight review, which I agree with in watching the fight just now, was Tszyu's hand speed. Sometimes his hand speed actually looked pretty good, but sometimes he was slowing it down a little bit, trying to gauge the openings and bide his time as to when to attack. And not only was he varying his hand speed, but it looked to me like he was varying the power as well. Similar to how Golovkin used to do when he was in his prime, when he was in his prompt, you know? But yeah, I mean, I was really impressed with Tszyu in this fight. I may have given Tony Harrison maybe the first, maybe one more. Aside from that, I felt Tszyu was well in control in this fight, and he looked good doing it as far as I'm concerned. I know some are going to say Tony Harrison isn't the fighter he once was. Not quite so sure about that. The last fight Tony Harrison had was against Sergio Garcia, who's a really good European level guy, and Tony Harrison styled on him, looked as good as Tony's looked for quite some time. So he's coming off that win. And yeah, Tszyu demolished. Let's not say demolished. He systematically demolished Tony Harrison. Good performance. Biggest fight of his career to date. Best opponents in his career to date. And he passed this test with flying colours. As far as I'm concerned, Tszyu is now the #1 contender. Regardless of sanctioning bodies, regardless of all that bullshit, Tszyu should be next in line. And I have to say, I think this performance by Tszyu has made that fight a lot more interesting, especially among the more casual viewers. Tszyu's a viable contender, he's a viable title challenger, and I'm telling you now, Jermell Charlo has his hands full. It's going to be a very good fight, in my opinion. I think this is going to be a very good fight. I'm not sure how I would lean on that one yet. I would need to go back and watch both guys to compare. But I'm looking forward to that. I want that fight to happen. I really want that fight to happen. I'll be super interested in that one. I think stylistically that'll be a fun fight as well. You know, but we'll see what happens there. Hopefully those two can get down and negotiate. I know Jermell Charlo had an injury relatively recently. They were supposed to fight, of course, in January. but Jamel Charlo got injured. I actually think in retrospect that's bad for Jamel Charlo, because when you look at Tszyu fight, he seems to get better every single fight. He seems to be improving every single fight. So I think Jamel Charlo now would be fighting a better version of Tim than he would in January just gone, if that fight happened then. So it's made this fight even better, in my opinion, this delay. But hopefully it happens next. If Jamel Charlo is still injured, I would like Tszyu to stay active. Even if he can't get like top quality opponents, just stay active and fight if Jamel Charlo's waiting around. But yeah, I mean, hopefully we get that fight next. What did you make of Tszyu's performance? Share your thoughts below. Beanie Guy Delboy. Peace.